we will move into our second session on the history of the Santa Ana watershed. So globally, our water is ancient. What we always say about water at LGC is that the water that you're drinking was one day dinosaur pee, and that's true. Every hydrologic or Earth's hydrologic cycle is a closed system. We have the same amount of water on the planet as we did when it first formed billions of years ago. Now let's talk locally. According to geologists, the Santa Ana River's course predates the uplift of the Santa Ana Mountains. The river cuts straight through these mountains at Santa Ana Canyon. Over time, frequent storms have deposited rich sediments on the coastal plains. And the water that we rely on each and every day, the water that many of you have some role in managing, took hundreds of thousands of years to accumulate, but we are using it at an exponential rate as an expendable resource. The history of this watershed begins with tribes who have been managing the waters and lands that we occupy since time immemorial. So I want to acknowledge that this sacred history would best be shared by a tribal representative, but we unfortunately weren't able to secure a tribal speaker in time for the workshop, so we'll do our best to share what we know. And if you want to learn more about local tribal ecological knowledge, we want to encourage you to identify the tribes in your area using the map shared in the chat and shared on the next slide, and contact your local tribal representatives. California's Native Americans historically moved with the river. They moved upland during flood times and back down to the river's banks during lower flows. Luiseño oral stories depict a rising ocean that once covered the entire countryside. The Tongva, who were the first to settle in Orange County, witnessed a flood that mingled the Santa Ana, the San Gabriel, and LA rivers and turned the coastal plain into a giant lake. Indigenous peoples sustainably managed the watershed until they were forcibly removed from their land by Western settlers, but they're still active and present today. The river has always influenced human development all over the world. Human civilizations have grown around water. Being social is intrinsically linked to our human relationship with water. And herein lies that complexity. We need the river to survive, to support our way of life, and yet it is also a threat to us. There's flooding, biological contaminants, vectors, pollutants. We both accept the river's life-giving water, but fear its wrath. So how do we balance that preservation of the river for ourselves and the ecosystems that it supports, while also protecting ourselves from these dangers? California's Native Americans understood this tension, which is why they moved with the river, but Western civilization has been much less flexible. We settled along the river and then used our immense power, our resources to dramatically reshape it. And yet the river still proves to be the stronger contender. I'll now introduce our guest speaker to provide the historical context of the Santa Ana River and the communities that it has sustained for centuries. I'll just need a moment to give the proper permissions. Daniel Cozad is the manager of the San Bernardino Valley Water Conservation District, which is responsible for recharging local and imported water into the Bunker Hill groundwater basin. While a chemist by training, Daniel has extensive experience in integrated regional water management, salinity, regional sustainability, groundwater, economic development, so much more. So I'll hand it over to Daniel. Is there do I need to share anything else? Oh, here we are. Okay, Daniel, you should have permissions now.
All right, it says I'm rejoining, so let's see, do you hear me okay?
Yes, we do.
And I'll share my screen. I'm in awe of people who make that look seamless. All right, so it looks like you can see the screen, and you had a great introduction, Atlee, on sort of the global view of water and the linkages. I do have a lot of experience working with lots of different folks in different watersheds throughout California, and spending most of my time here in the Santa Ana watershed. So we're relatively close to the top of the watershed, not the very top up in Big Bear, but relatively close to the top of the watershed. And we'll sort of use the upper end of the Santa Ana as a microcosm to talk about the development and history of the Santa Ana watershed. So all of life is linked by a single element. There may be lots of other linkages, but certainly water is critical to all life that we understand here on Earth. And all life in a watershed is drawn to the river and its tributaries. If you go out on a hike anywhere, you'll find that people will be close to the water source if there is one in an area. Maybe that's in our DNA or in our background, but both Indigenous people as well as anyone walking on trails today will stop and look at water. These truths, as Atlee said, drove the exploration, settlement, and development along the Santa Ana watershed. Its river has most of its major cities, and its tributaries are along the edges of the mountains where water is readily available. So I am the general manager of the San Bernardino Valley Water Conservation District. As Atlee said, we put water into the ground in the upper watershed so that it's available to those who pump water below. And we manage a very large area, 4,000 plus acres, for both ecological as well as groundwater recharge. Behind me in my background is a picture of spreading grounds a couple of years ago in 2019 when we had a lot more rain than we have today. So Atlee gave you some of the statistics, so I'll bypass those, but it is a diverse watershed with a lot of people and parts of 4 counties. And while water agencies are split into lots of special districts and services for, as Atlee said, efficiency, they're integrated, especially in this watershed, maybe more than any other watershed in the state of California. That's the picture that you saw before in sort of a topographic relief. So you can see the areas. Really, this watershed is bounded by mountain edges, and some have called them the Saints, Santa Ana Mountains, the San Bernardino Mountains, the San Gabriel Mountains, and San Jacinto's, as we'll talk a little bit about the history as we get forward. Here's a little bit different map. You can see some of those same relief areas in the map, and see also some of the things we'll be talking about later. But early development had a number of different. They were typically called ditches and washes, and the area that you see sort of behind my picture we refer to as the Santa Ana Wash area. And all of the things we'll talk about in the upper watershed occurred in this area, which was very important. So Atlee started with some of the historic Native American occupation of this area, and we don't at the district have a lot of written history before about 1810. Certainly, there was a lot of written history before that time, maybe not written, but passed down, and the tribes in our area have a lot of information orally that can be provided about their use of the local area. The Mill Creek Zanha in 1819 was constructed and was 12 miles long along the southern side of the Santa Ana River. And it was constructed by tribal members, and it goes from we'll show a map here in a little bit, but it goes from Mill Creek all the way down to what is current day Loma Linda. And the Native American labor constructed that facility under the direction and general oversight of the Franciscans who came over to settle the area. And so in the longer version of this, we had a lot of interesting stories to share about some of those efforts and the details of what went on. But you can see here on the map, Mill Creek, the Zanha, that was the source of life through the early part of the development in the history of the Santa Ana. There were also development in the lower part of the Santa Ana, and here you can see a little bit of City Creek, Plunge Creek, the Santa Ana River, and Mill Creek. So these major tributaries in the Santa Ana River all come together in the valley, which provided a broad alluvial fan. So that's created by the sediment and water coming out of the mountains and in the flattening area below, just below the Santa Ana, the fault zones. It spreads out and has flatter areas, and the sediment drops out. You can see in light blue here also the spreading grounds that are used by the conservation district for recharge. So shortly after the mission period, we'll call it the Mexican to Mormon period, there was a Mexican rancho, San Bernardino, about 35,000 acres, granted to the Lugos, a family originally from Los Angeles, Spanish family by Governor Alvarado. And they ranched in this area. San Bernardino covered the areas of city of San Bernardino, Fontana, Rialto, and Redlands. And then, of course, in 1848, the Mexican-American War occurred, and the land transferred from Mexico to the United States at the time. And in 1851, the Lugos sold their land to Mormon settlers. And amongst those creeks you'll see in this area is one named after Captain Lytle, who was part of that settlement. So many of these early facilities were named after folks who were here during the mid 1800s. I note that it was sold for $77,500, and when I did this a year and a half ago, that was about 15% of the median household sales price for the area. So even by those standards, it was probably a bargain. The Zoom format isn't so good because I can't tell whether you thought that was funny or not, but we'll move on either way. San Bernardino County was formed shortly after statehood in 1853. In 1854, a water commission was formed in order to, well, you can see what's written there, but in order to basically suss out and fight over water in 8 agricultural counties, with San Bernardino being one of those. In 1856, the first formal water rights challenges were filed. And in 1857, the Mormons were recalled from their land. It was sold and divided by verbal agreement. Water was divided up in that same way until 1859. So once we were a state and people had settled here, you needed a couple of things to homestead land in order to become the owner and proper user of that land, to have the rights to the land. You had to have water, you had to be able to grow crops, and you had to be able to have a home there. So development of the land rapidly became development of water and people to farm it. So even early on, water was shared. They used that same ditch, and they realized that they couldn't get all the water they needed. So you can read there, they devised a method for sharing the water that was in the ditch. Some would take it in the evening and some would take it in the morning, and that allowed everybody to have their full water right. Interestingly enough, the water that was turned into the ditch that you didn't use at the time was called wastewater. Now wastewater means something completely different, but there was a quest after that to turn wastewater into usable water, much like the recycled water projects we do now. Along a history beginning in the late 1850s through 60s and on of litigation related to water rights, primarily Mill Creek. Mill Creek in the legal journals is described as one of the most litigated water bodies in the state of California, mostly because it started so early. You can see there the folks looking at the wasted water, in other words, water not used. And by about 1880, they had exhausted all the water that could make it to, say, Loma Linda and San Bernardino, and began moving further up that fan closer to the mouth of the canyon to be able to have additional water, which sunk into the ground and they deemed at the time to be wasted. Now, the Conservation District does that on purpose to allow people to pump water. But by 1885, the development of facilities to capture that water were underway. And by 1890, the Bear Valley facilities brought Santa Ana River water. And late in the 1800s, in 1898 to 1904, there was a severe drought. And there began a movement to begin not only utilizing surface water, but begin putting in wells for the use of groundwater, especially further to the west where surface waters didn't make it. In the beginning, early on, water from the Santa Ana River and Mill Creek and its tributaries would run most of the year. And by the mid 1800s, it began to not run all the way, and especially at the end of the summer and in dry times. And by the 1900s, there was not enough water for large stretches of the year to support the agriculture which had built up here. So in 1854, it was Rancho and moved into the Mormon period. Between about 1888, the Zonha was built, and Redlands and Crafton used that. And interestingly, you think about talking about these dates, but it's difficult to put into perspective. At the time, the county of Riverside and the county of San Bernardino were all the county of San Bernardino. It wasn't until 1893 that Riverside became its own county, and Highland and Redlands began to expand in the early 1900s, very early 1900s with Big Bear water. It didn't take too much longer after that for the folks in Orange County to begin to litigate with the Conservation District and those using water upstream to ensure that they received the appropriate amount of water downstream. So sometimes a picture helps to look at that. This is the Santa Ana Canyon, and these guys are out there because they're having a bad day. This is a flume that goes across the top that transports water at a higher elevation so that it can go through a penstock and generate electricity and then be used for irrigation. And there's obviously a leak. So that's the reason for the pictures, to figure out what that looked like. And this is the area that you see behind me, but many, many years earlier. You can see the basins that were put into place. This is a picture from probably around the 30s. And these basins, these little levees that came across, helped the water from the Santa Ana River sink into the ground. Well, in 1942, the Irvine Company, James Irvine, and the land grant in Orange County, tired of spending the money to sue folks upstream, and formed Orange County Water District. And they refiled some of the same rights. There was a settlement that limited how much water could be spread in the basins. In 1951, Orange County Water District sued Redlands, San Bernardino, Colton, and Riverside. And up through the 60s, those lawsuits were filed, resulting ultimately in a settlement on the Santa Ana River, as well as Western, which is Riverside County, and San Bernardino adjudications in 1969. So the upper watershed is fully adjudicated. There's Chino Basin, Western, Riverside County, and San Bernardino County all have adjudications such that everybody knows what their water rights are and they're able to use them. In fact, the Santa Ana Watershed Project Authority was formed shortly after the 1969 adjudication to manage water quality and the facilities necessary to support the adjudications. So we've had 100 years of managing water, which is critical to agriculture, agriculture being critical to homesteading, settlement, and the development that followed. Those developments provided economic value and jobs and the quality of life that we have here today. And we're relearning really. Atlee began with how much things have come together in integration, but really in reality, they began that way. Water management was integrated in the beginning because the same people worked in many of these same organizations and had to cooperate and work together in order to make all of it work. We have, as Atlee mentioned before, fire, flood, and drought. There was many of our organizations were derived from droughts. The Water Conservation District began shortly after the 1889 to 1903 drought, and they requested that the President and Congress set aside 4 sections of land from the Homestead Act. You can see those sections of land behind me. And there was a Tri-County Reforestation Committee and Water Conservation Association that were formed in the early 1900s in order to help recharge that water. And they funded that with $1 per rail car load of oranges. They understood that the farmers didn't have the money, but the packing houses did. And those voluntary payments paid for the first works of the Water Conservation District. And in 1932, the Water Conservation District was formed, and the assets of the Water Conservation Association were provided to the district. The area here has agricultural origins, as I explained. You can see some of the statistics there, but both Riverside, San Bernardino, Redlands, Colton, all of those areas began their settlement as agricultural areas. Not just oranges, but wine grapes, raisin grapes, and wheat and other crops were grown here early on. This is kind of the picture of the watershed. You'll remember our friend Captain Lytle. This is the creek named after him. You have Cajon Creek and Devil Canyon, East Twin and Warm Creek, and then City, Plunge, Santa Ana River, and Mill Creek as the major. San Timoteo Creek comes in over here. These are the major creeks that feed the basin that we manage in this upper part of the watershed. Just a few pictures to show you what some of those early facilities look like. Head gates that were built. I can't say that those exact head gates are still there because I can't tell from this picture where it is, but we have gates that look exactly like that and still work pretty much the same way today. These open ditches were eventually diverted to spread water to the spreading grounds. And just one observation, we have a number of pictures of these facilities. And what that means is that they were important enough to early folks that they took pictures of them, because back then not everybody had a camera in their cell phone. If you are in Riverside, you might see Peddly Avenue. There's also a Peddly Dam, which is essentially just rocks encased in wire, like a grabbion, but used to back up water and slow it and infiltrate it. So lots of interesting history. And then in 1930, they built the primary diversion weirs and gates. And I want you to look for just a minute at this picture. There's a lot of guys out here, and there are good hats and there are suits and ties, and there are a few ladies, if you look carefully, who are dressed up in their hats. And this is the ribbon cutting for this facility, and it's obviously been planned well ahead. There are a number of pictures of it, but the other thing that you can see is, like many public works projects, it hasn't been completed. They did the They scheduled when it was supposed to be completed and got everybody out there, but it just hadn't been finished yet. But this marked the first time there was a weir across the Santa Ana River, essentially a dam, if you will, and a permanent diversion works to make those make that area an all-weather diversion. It was named after Francis Cuttle in 1933. He was the first the person who was really responsible for the Water Conservation Association. And if we weren't limited in time today, I'd tell you lots of great stories about Francis Cuttle, who was good friends with the governors during his term and the presidents, and we have boxes of correspondence related to that. Here's that diversion facility a few years ago when they tested Seven Oaks Dam. That's 7,000 CFS, which if you're used to rivers back east or in Northern California isn't that much water, but 7,000 CFS is the maximum diversion or the maximum amount of water that can be released from Seven Oaks Dam. These are what the spreading grounds look like in the 30s. They were not as defined as they are today, but spread out in that area below Seven Oaks Dam. And that's what they look like today. Our basins are, at least the pictures are a little prettier, but they still work in the very same way they did before. We have basins in Santa Ana and Mill Creek, about 76 basins in total. So the river provides many services to the people of the Santa Ana watershed. It's a floodway for storms to make their way to the ocean. It provides precious habitat for species. It's really a pipeline for drinking water to move from the upper watershed to the lower watershed under regulation and that authority. It provides recreation and park-like amenities. It's also home for homeless in the river. And all of these are in conflict with each other and have to be managed together. So just a few pictures of what some of the flooding has looked like in the area. 1934, major flood damage. This is down closer to, that's in Orange County, that lost their bridge across the road. Seven Oaks Dam was constructed to improve the flood conditions on the river, essentially to take pressure off of Prado Dam, which is the lower dam. So Seven Oaks Dam is the highest dam after Big Bear Lake, and helps to significantly increase the recharge that we're able to do because of it can hold back some water. However, if you look carefully at the picture there, you'll see that that water looks pretty brown. We often get very silty water, and so it takes a bit to get that recharged and into the ground. Home to a number of endangered species. The Santa Ana sucker is one endangered fish. You have the Santa Ana woolly star, and this is the San Bernardino kangaroo rat, several of those that are part of the WASH plan, a plan and habitat conservation program for the development of all of the efforts in the WASH area. As the water is a pipeline to Orange County for its drinking water use, that adjudication provided them 232,000 acre feet of water, and that water has to be at a TDS, a salt level of 700 or less, otherwise they get more water. And they were very early on in the understanding that the water supply and the water quality were intricately connected. We've recharged a lot of water over time. In fact, we had a record in 2019, almost 70,000 acre feet of water. That was both because of the Groundwater Council's water purchases and a relatively wet year. Santa Ana River provides trails and parks. This is a map out of the Santa Ana River Conservancy's plans. And you have homeless that utilize areas of the river because it's out of the sight of folks in cities. So that causes great problems with fire, as well as incompatible use of some of those habitat areas. The discord amongst all of these activities and efforts has brought people together in the Santa Ana watershed to work together. So a picture of the old and Grand Prix fires, but some of the fire areas from the summer are also shown along here. So most of the headworks of the upper watershed has burned. These are fairly dramatic pictures. I could have some from the last couple of years, but here's a picture of Day Creek, which is on the west side, and shows the amount of debris and charred, burned area that piles up. And of course, all of that slides off as water comes down over those burned areas and creates lots of water quality problems, even as far down as Imperial Valley. I'm sorry, Imperial Road crossing the Santa Ana River. So 100 years later, we have 3 counties that are still working together. We still have the same plagues that we had earlier on, maybe more severely. Fire, flood, and drought are still things that we have to contend with and work through. The water conservation need is probably more than it has ever been, and the planning and work together amongst all of the entities is significant and requires the leadership and thoughtfulness of these groups as they work together. So already covered a lot of the diversity of the area and the need to have a sustainable source of water and resources for the folks who are here. And that's, of course, where integrated planning came together. When we had a little bit more time, we talked a little bit more about some of the things that were coming up for integrated planning in the future. But one great example of them is a groundwater council that was formed in 2017. Voluntary agreement after all those lawyers. We only had one lawyer involved to write the agreement. And everybody in the upper watershed contributes funding to ensure that enough water is purchased so that the upper watershed is in balance. So we expect that there'll be a bright future for recharge and for the upper watershed. And there's just a few bullets. My last bullet on the last slide is that the best use of lawyers is really to craft agreements that help people work together and avoid future litigation. And that there's sort of a peace dividend because lawyers are expensive, and if you can use one instead of many, you can build a bright future for folks working in the watershed. Pretty much all I have, Atlee.
Thanks so much, Daniel. That was great. We do have some questions coming in the chat, so I'd love to jump to those. First question, are there any indigenous tribes that have legal water rights in California?
There are. Most tribes that had water use have water rights, and so there are not as many in the Santa Ana as there are, say, in the desert. In the Palm Springs area, there's actually been recent litigation where the tribes won not only an unquantified right, but won the right to quantify the amount of water. So yes, they do have rights, and most tribes have water rights.
How do you see the Inland Empire's anticipating housing boom impacting regional water sources?
Well, we're extraordinarily lucky. First off, we're in a great location. We have all these rivers that come together in the area, and we sit on a coastal plain. So clouds like those come over and rain, and we've got big mountains behind us, so they leave lots of rain on this side. That's why there's a desert on the other side. We also had forefathers who were very thoughtful in the way that they developed water resources. We had amazingly smart men and women. In the longer version, I had lots of great discussions of interesting women who were instrumental in the development of water in this area. But so we have connections to the State Water Project. Parts of the watershed have connections to the Colorado River. And then, of course, we have our own local water, so we're well situated. We also, as I said, have the Groundwater Council, who's buying enough water for the development that is planned in 2040, which means we should have a sustainable program, maybe one of the best in California.
LGC. What is the timing and benefit from the habitat conservation plan process that has been undertaken in our region?
Oh, I am so happy to say that late in July of last year, the WASH Plan HCP was approved by our Conservation District's Board of Directors and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So it's complete. That's been a long time coming, but I'm very happy to say it's complete. We're working on finalizing waters permitting as well as California Department of Fish and Wildlife permitting, and those should be done in probably about a year from now. So that all the facilities for all of the WASH Plan Task Force partners in the Santa Ana WASH will be complete probably by about this time next year.
And I'll close it out since we're running low on time with this final question. What is the role of water managers in land use decision making?
Well, there's lots of debate in different areas about whether water managers ought to lead land development. That's certainly what they did before. They were 150 years ago. They were intricately connected. They were the same people. Today in the Santa Ana watershed, I probably talk to city planning folks at least a couple times a month, if not weekly, on various aspects, and we certainly comment and help provide information. That varies in California. It varies by area. Certainly, if you're a water leader and you're watching this, it's because you're insightful enough to know that you want to think about how land use lays out. Conservation is certainly essential, but planning for smart water use can really help the future and the sustainability of not just the Santa Ana, but all throughout the state. We have plenty of water available if we use it smartly to meet the population and housing challenges we have with no more water than we have today.
Absolutely, and it perfectly ties with our upcoming workshop on February 3rd. So that's workshop 2, collaborative planning in the face of uncertainty. We'll discuss that. We also have some opportunities and resources to share at the end of today's presentation that can help speak to that interaction between water and land use. So I want to say a huge thank you to Daniel for joining us today. It's been a pleasure. And with that, see if I can switch. We are going to go into a break, but I do just want to close out this session discussing why this matters and why we're talking about the history of the watershed. As we've shared today, those past decisions were based on those point in time scenarios, not an integrated thinking mindset. And that's a precursor to the rest of today's presentation. We've had this fragmented system thus far, but local governments are so critical to changing that, and we need a new mindset, especially in this face of uncertainty, particularly with COVID-19. And so when we come back after our break, we'll talk about how we can look at those overlapping systems with this new framework.